Hello, everyone. I know that you are all currently connecting to your audio, so I'll take this opportunity to welcome everyone to our book club event. This is a very special event that is centered around Norman Lebrecht's book, Why Mahler, How One Man and 10 Symphonies Changed the World. Joining me today to talk about this wonderful book, in addition to all of you wonderful people out there, is the music director and maestro of the Tucson Symphony Orchestra, José Luis Gomez. Hello, Jose.
Hello, Ben. Nice to see you. Nice to see everybody.
Now, I remember when this book was first brought to my attention. It was actually brought to my attention by a wonderful patron and supporter of the Tucson Symphony Orchestra, our friend Steven Sarper, who left a couple of copies of the book at the office. And this was a few years ago, I believe, after a performance that the orchestra did of Mahler's massive Third Symphony. And from that point on, not only was the book on my radar, but the book's author was very much on my radar because I realized that he was the man who was behind the very famous, or maybe I should say infamous, Slipped Disc blog, as well as all of the news that comes from his Twitter feed. Without being too reductive, I think it's probably fair to refer to Mr. Lebrecht as a veritable classical music industry gossip columnist. But to end the conversation about him there would be greatly unfair. He's written several books, and probably his most loved of his classical music books is this book that we're talking about here. And if those of you out there were fortunate enough to watch the interview between Jose Luis and Mr. Lebrecht that we posted a little while ago, you will realize that there are probably very few people on the planet who know more about Gustav Mahler, not just his music, but the man himself. Wouldn't you agree, Jose?
Absolutely. I believe that for all of us, the moment that we want to expand our horizons in classical music or orchestral music repertoire, the moment that you touch Mahler, your life changes. I think somehow you start maybe with Bach, which is the fundamental part of the spinal cord of your musical taste somehow. Then you touch this wonderful man of Mozart, the music of Mozart. Then you get to touch the music of Beethoven, and you're fascinated. But once you get to Mahler, then you're totally blown away. And I think that's what this book actually gives a chance to, because Mr. Lebrecht, being someone that uh, has been fascinated about Mahler since many, many years, he also got into that dynamic of finding and scratching the surface more to know all of these details, because there's many biographers. There was this, late widow, Alma Schiller, that then, got married to Gropius, the famous architect, and, then a famous writer later on, and lived in America. And she was the one who kept the echo of Mahler into the modern times, but scratching the surface into all these things is what Mr. Lebrecht has done it beautifully, because it gives a very interesting personal view of this iconic figure.
Now, I want to touch on something that you mentioned at the beginning of what you were just saying, which is the sort of importance of Mahler to musicians, how there's for classical musicians and orchestra musicians and conductors. And uh, when you get to Mahler, it feels kind of like a monumental moment in your life as a musician. You and I are both violin players. We both spent a lot of time playing in orchestras. I don't know that I could tell you the first time I played a Brahms symphony or the first time I played a Tchaikovsky symphony, although I love those symphonies more than most things in the world. I definitely remember my first Mahler symphony. And I also remember that the very first symphony that I ever played with the Tucson Symphony Orchestra was Mahler's Fifth Symphony. So, what was your first Mahler experience?
I totally agree with you, Ben. I mean, I can remember certain composers that I played as a kid in the youth orchestra in Venezuela, but definitely I remember Mahler when we played, in my case, when I played for the first time a symphony. It was the first symphony, and I got the chance to play it as a concertmaster. So that was, you look at that monumental symphony and you expect at least to have all these amazing solos, but there's a couple of interventions. So you understand, I think it was a very good example for me as a kid of, 13 years old, to know that a conductor embraces all these sounds. So it's never anymore, waiting for that solo in Scheherazade or that solo in Russian Easter, Overture, Festival Overture of Korsakov. that, as a violinist, you want that. So you look at the conductor and you look at the composer in one person. So that was for me a huge thing, because it was a massive sound in which you have, there's actually a couple of little things that the concertmaster does, because there's a couple of solos there, but the orchestral music of the 20th century somehow became incredibly alive, even though there is many other things that then you experience. But yes, it was First Symphony, actually.
So talk a little bit about this experience with this book, because you obviously are somebody who knows a lot about Mahler and his music before you even get to the point of reading a book like this. And then, of course, you had the wonderful experience of actually talking to the author. How would you say your perception of Mahler shifted? What were some things that you feel like you learned that you absolutely did not know before you sort of undertook this experience of preparing for this book club?
I would say many. It is fascinating to see, well, first of all, to speak with someone that obviously is very well articulated into the details, and also on the reasoning why certain things are being explained in the book. I love biographies, but this is not a biography. This is actually a very personal explanation of Mahler's life and music together. And so definitely I was inspired. I even maybe some of you have remembered that part of the conversation which he explains about, that beginning of the First Symphony, that sound of, a very, steady A played in the violins in harmonics, which, he made an example of that when he went to his birth town, that that place, that he heard as a kid, the air, the breeze of the air. So that was an explanation. This is something that obviously it takes a little bit of poetry and the approach of a writer to make it so beautiful, but it is true. Then it starts to make sense. You can get different pictures when you want to define a phrase of a symphony, of a piece of music. But in that case, I would say that it's very accurate. So, I mean, I appreciate that you think that I know a lot of Mahler, but I'm like many people that we're discovering so many things every time we open a score of this fantastic composer. There is any way that I would say that I know Mahler more than anyone else. I know a little bit more every time, so that's for sure. And this book had helped a lot into that sense. And I'm sure for all of you, when you get to listen to one of the symphonies, if you follow a little bit of that listening guide that I gave, also did some on the website of the Tucson Symphony, you can relate many of the things that he's telling with the music that you're hearing. So it's very explanatory in many ways. So that's also very, very amazing about this book, which I found it incredibly entertaining as well.
Yeah, I think it's really important to remember every composer puts important elements of their personal life into their music. We know about Brahms's unrequited love for Clara Schumann. We know about Beethoven's struggles with his own deafness and how he felt about his place in the world, and and Schubert, and how all these things sort of played out in their music. But I think it's safe to say that the interjection, the injection of one's personal life and personal tragedy and all these different things, the way that Mahler put that into his music, there's really nothing like it. And I think that that's at least partially a good explainer for the enormity, not just of sound, but of expression in his music.
Definitely. I think he obviously he was like many composers, starting from Bach and Mozart and Beethoven and Schumann. They were ahead of their time. They were doing things that at the right moment they were doing them. It was maybe not easy for people to understand, but that greatness was reflected during his time, but even more right now, especially is so in actual times. You can relate the music to many of the things that can happen to your personal life, to the life of your country, to the life of the world, of a certain event. It's very I wouldn't say easy, but it's very approachable in that sense. You can see yourself mirrored in that music in many different ways. on the other hand, it's not easy music. It's very complex. So that complexity, when you want to understand also the man behind the music, then it becomes really complex. And that's something that also I learned, during the conversation with Mr. Lebrecht, that that he was a composer also, that he meant many things with the same motive. It's like he made example of the Fifth Symphony, that beginning of that adagietto that sounds like sad music, but on the other hand is a love letter to his wife. That his wife, on the other hand, you know, we all know that she was, she started to have an affair with another person, and Mahler was suffering a lot of that. So it's a mixture of many things sometimes in one piece of music, and it's up to us to, if we want to identify all those differences and nuances, and probably also adapt the ones that makes us feel something special.
Well, on that note, I think it would be a good time because we have a nice collection of folks here today to talk about this book. So we want to take some questions from you. The first thing that I'm going to do actually is I'm going to read a question that one of our guests has placed into the chat. This is from Judith, who I believe is a member of our wonderful TSO course. Hi, Judith. I'm going to read your question. Thank you very much for submitting it via text. But before I do, I just want to say, if you would like to submit a question, you can click the raise hand app so that we can call on you just like we did back in school. And you can answer your question. Because we do have so many people here today, we do ask that you limit it to one question per person, and we are going to try to get to everybody as much as we possibly can. And when we call on you, be sure we will request that you unmute yourself. Make sure that you unmute yourself so that we can hear you. So here is the first question. This is coming again from Judith. She says, first, thank you for this fabulous experience. I do have a question. I think it's not so much in style these days for a conductor to change the music of the masters, although Mahler had no qualms about it, apparently. I wonder whether sometimes you are tempted to revise a Mahler passage, or dare I suggest, even like a Beethoven instrumentation.
Thank you, Judith. That is actually a very interesting question. I wouldn't dare to do that, to be honest. Not because I think, anybody should be able or not, in terms of capabilities or skills. You can always, try to maybe add a couple of things, but not as many changes as he did personally, with certain music that was very iconic also in his time. Beethoven 9, he made an arrangement for bigger orchestra of that iconic symphony, and actually he got a lot of bad feedback from the people who were really conservationists, people in Vienna. They were saying, what is this man doing? But he had a point. He was also living in a time where music was needed to be expressed in a very grandeur manner. I believe that the tendency and the willingness of certain artists was just to resonate more and more certain kind of music, and especially Beethoven being a composer that was so admired by the whole, since his death, and by composers like Wagner, Liszt. So I would say that when with the music that he touched in that case, Beethoven 9, Schubert, he made an arrangement for string orchestra, which is basically just added the bass line and just expanded the strings of the Death and the Maiden quartet. What I would never do with the Mahler symphony, because I don't think nobody will do it, is to try to change any of the structure of it. Things that you can do is just try to look at the changes that he was making during the course during the process of composing. I'll make an example. If you take the Symphony Number 6, the so-called tragic, that symphony, it's a little bit polemic because first of all, there is this thing about which is the order of the second and the third movement, because Mahler gave us a little bit of an open window, since he started with one version, and then when he did it again in another place later on in the years, he made a revision, and then he switched the movements. And then after his death, his late widow Alma Schindler, she was saying that no, Mahler wanted scherzo and andante. So there is a lot of who was right, and I think Mahler left it to the, in that case, left it to the conductor or, to the performer. This is said also by Mr. Lebrecht in our conversation, that Mahler was, he was very meticulous in many of the things. And when you look at score, I haven't seen any score of any other composer that is so incredibly full of indications for the performers. But on the other hand, he specifically said, I want people to also feel to do differently certain things. So in many ways, he left windows open, but I don't think he left windows open for changing structure like that you would do in other things. I personally think that certain other composers, you can try to do different things. It's like in a Beethoven symphony, in the Eroica, there is a section in which the clarinets have a part that plays together with the violas, but sometimes they are not heard very easy. So you can ask them to put the bells up. You can boost certain instrument differently. You can change the dynamics a little bit in order to make it work for the musical result. But I wouldn't change anything of the structure, nor in Mahler, nor in Beethoven, nor in anybody. But specifically in Mahler, because I think his structure was also a result of many tries and changes. And he gave these options. Also in the Sixth Symphony, there is 3 hammer blows or 2 hammer blows, even though he started with 5 hammer blows. So he left a little bit of room for improvisation, but I will say only in those things.
I think it's worth mentioning too, Jose. You talked about the tremendous amount of detail that can be found in Mahler's scores. Mahler is one of the few of the sort of standard, if maybe the only that I can think of the big standard symphonic composers whose scores, when you even get them now, even if it's like a reprint from Dover, the first page or two is a glossary of terms, because he does not just give you allegro, andante, these kinds of simple, very general Italian terms that we find all over the music of Beethoven and Brahms, but very, very detailed, descriptive words, all in German. And for those of you who know the German language, how you can take one very, very long word and have it express a very complex idea. That's all over Mahler's scores. And if you don't know what those things mean, it's absolutely baffling. And so you start off, when you open page 1 of a score of Mahler's Second Symphony, you're going to read a very large page of glossary of terms so that you know when he's telling you how to speed up little by little gradually, but it's in German and it looks totally insane. You need to know that, but that really speaks to the level of detail that is in Beethoven's music. Okay, so just a reminder for you folks who would like to ask a question, if you would like to digitally raise your hand, you can do so by bringing up the participant panel, and then raise hand is actually a button in there. You can also type a question into the chat if you like, or you can just frantically wave your arms at me, because I am looking at all of you right now, or at least most of you, I think, to ask a question of Jose Luis. So does anybody else have a question that they would like to ask right now about why Mahler? Okay, Bob Hungate. Bob, how are you? I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself. And once you have done that, please give us your question. Bob is a wonderful supporter of the Tucson Symphony Orchestra, who for many, many years was a patron of the Boston Symphony Orchestra, I believe. And now he is a wonderful, regular guest and contributor to the Tucson Symphony Orchestra. He's having a little bit of trouble unmuting himself right now. So I'm going to ask a very quick question of Jose Luis that has come up in the chat, because I think you can give a very quick answer to this. Do you have any plans to do a complete Mahler cycle?
Yes, of course. We are, I mean, as much as we can, we plan to always have, because audience loves it. I know you love it. I love it, definitely, to have at least one of the Mahler symphonies performed during our season. As you know, we planned to end last season, so the season 1920, with Mahler's Second Symphony, and we had planned for this January, actually, for, I think it was this week, if I'm not mistaken, this week or the next one, to do Mahler's Fourth Symphony. So, as you know, one of the characteristics of Mahler is he uses the huge force of the orchestra, so always on a big side of orchestras. We need to know now, when we come back after the pandemic, to plan accordingly and see when can we be ready to do one of those Mahler symphonies for sure. And I wouldn't unveil anything, because otherwise they have to kill me. But yes, there is one Mahler symphony that is planned to be done, for next season, hopefully, if everything goes well. So little by little, I mean, one of the things, and I'll make it short, that I find also very positive, that the orchestra has done several of the Mahler symphonies. So it's good to have an opportunity also to go through the ones that haven't been played recently. So that's also in the plan.
All right, let's see if we can get Bob's audio here.
Okay, well, I'm sorry I couldn't get mine unmuted.
No problem.
But reading the book about Mahler, I was very impressed by the interplay between his conducting and his composing. And I'm curious, you are, in my mind, a renowned conductor. And I'm wondering if you do a Mahler symphony, third, fourth, any one, how much variation there is in the length of this symphony one time versus another. Do you tend to always end up with the same length, or does it vary based on your mood of the day? Make sense?
Fantastic. That's a fantastic question. Thank you, Bob. Actually, there's no simple answer, but there is a very plausible answer, which is yes, it changes, and I think it has to change. There is, because of the mood of you when you're performing, the orchestra itself, the orchestra, the one that you're performing with, it depends on that way of the orchestra breathes. But obviously you should have a plan of how the pace of the music, in the case of Mahler, it's going to be taken. It can be stretched, it can be shortened in a little bit in a little bit of a way, but it shouldn't be like you do it 10 minutes longer or 10 minutes shorter. I think in my case it varies a little bit in certain things. You should not, because you should stick to a plan that has to be strict. I don't think that's the way music should be conceived. But on the other hand, you should be able to have a concrete idea that should stay in the boundaries of your interpretation. Otherwise, it becomes a little bit disorganized, and for sure the result is going to be not as pleasant as if you follow a certain guideline and pattern that you wanted to, or pace basically that you wanted to establish. So it shouldn't change much. I think it changes maybe the way you did one symphony maybe 5 years before, and if you do it again with a different orchestra, with a different approach, because you started to scratch more the surface and you find things that you wanted to do differently, things that you did maybe too fast in the past, now you want to take it a little bit slower and a little bit different. Yes, that's probably happens to all of us as performers, that we need to take different views sometimes, without being extremist, but basically you should be able to change also the way you did music in the past. Claudio Abbado interpretation of the whole Mahler symphonies with the Wiener Philharmonic many years ago is so different from the last ones that he did with the Lucerne Symphony when he was older. Not because he was older, just because he also had a different vision for certain things. Certain things were even faster than when he was younger. So it has to change a little bit.
I see we have a raised hand from our good friend Karen Bonick. I'm going to ask you to unmute, Karen, and thank you very much in advance for your question. And as soon as that little red icon is gone, you should be able to ask Jose your question. Oh, looks like you're good to go, Karen.
Okay. I just had a question that piggybacks on what Jose just was talking about, doing different Mahler symphonies. The eighth, I understand, is a huge undertaking, and I can't even visualize that happening by the TSO, because I think Lebrecht said that it would take 1,000 performers, which seemed excessive to me, but what do I know? At any rate, does anybody do the Eighth Symphony? because it's such a massive undertaking. 2 choruses and a children's chorus and 2 or
Yes, Karen, that's a very nice question. It's true. The title is called The Symphony of a Thousand. So hypothetically, I think he was just being very romantic and very metaphorical about the amount of people on stage. You don't need to have 1,000 people. I don't think. I mean, there is. I'm gonna tell you, and maybe it's not close to 1,000 at all, but it's. I think it's the biggest that I've seen, that I remember at least, is the one that Gustavo Dudamel did with LA Philharmonic and the Simón Bolívar Orchestra in Venezuela and also in LA. But just they put 2 orchestras together and many choruses together, and they played it in a place. Well, the one they did in Venezuela, there's a very nice DVD. They did it in this concert hall. It was incredibly packed of people. So you can go big, enormous with this symphony. So to answer the other part of your question, yes, it's actually done fairly, I would say, often for that kind of symphony. It's not that it's never done. It's done. And actually, there was one comment that I saw in the chat that Phoenix Symphony did it with about 300 people. We could do the same thing. I mean, we're planning and dreaming to doing it. I'm just waiting for the right moment to do it, because that's a symphony that needs to have a message as well. You know, many of the other symphonies are symphonies, you know, the first, the third, the fifth especially, are the ones that stay a little bit on the right track of many musical seasons. You know, you can do it as an opening, you can do it as a closing of the season, you can do it also in the middle. You know, our symphonies that are, you know, or are very easy to recognize. But the eighth, which is a beautiful one, has a very special meaning. So you have to also program it accordingly with something. Normally it comes, you know, with anniversaries. Normally it comes with, you know, closing a cycle. So you leave a little bit the eighth to the end. And I think, you know, that I won't tell you much, but that might be a little bit of the direction that I want to take with that particular symphony, which is actually the only one that hasn't been in Tucson played. So all the other symphonies have been played at the Tucson Symphony during the course of the history of the symphony, but the eighth has been always kept aside. One little thing that it's curious about that symphony, I played it actually many times with different orchestras. One, I played it actually here where I'm staying right now in Vienna. I played it at the Musikverein with a youth orchestra called the Gustav Mahler Youth Orchestra, and that was a kind of a Pan-American orchestra. So he had people from Europe, but also from the US and from other places, and the best talent, you know, the auditions and this and that. And they for that symphony, they really go to the extreme. So, but when we played at the Musikverein, which is a beautiful hall that maybe you have it familiar because it's the hall where they do the New Year's concert of the Vienna Philharmonic, it's not a big stage. So we had to reduce a little bit of that numbers. So, but nonetheless, I think this symphony has the grandiosity itself because of the double chorus and the children's chorus and the 8 soloists that it has. So all of these things makes it to look very big, and it has that energy, but it can be done without getting to 1,000. It was just named the Symphony of 1,000, and it was one of those examples of symphonies that I think wanted just to break the whole's capability of taking the sound. Mahler was experimenting too. I think in that case, he was just trying to make it as big as possible.
We have a few more questions in the chat, and once again, thank you folks for submitting those. The first one that says, thank you for this opportunity. This is from Sandra, excuse me. I read Mahler use the pentatonic scale in his work. How is this significant? How did this impact symphonic music? Now, there are a lot of different answers to this because you can talk about the usage of sort of exotic timbres that he may have been aware of, or vernacular music that was from where he was originally from, right?
It's true. It's true. That's actually what I was about to say. It takes, you know, Mahler was, let's not forget that Mahler was living in a moment also that music was getting to a point in which it needed a change. It needed a rethinking. When you look at his, let's say, after the fifth, especially, you know, his later symphonies, 6th, 7th, 8th, even 9th and 10th, he starts to go into that world of expressionism that other younger people that actually admire him, like Arnold Schoenberg, Alban Berg, were already, being anxious of doing and imprinting in their music. And Mahler used all the resources, pentatonic scales. He started to use a little bit of the 12 tone, method without, getting into the series or anything. But you feel that sense of, of breaking the boundaries, with normal tonality patterns that other composers, were a little bit more strict, like maybe Brahms. If you want to make an example, let's not forget Brahms was alive when Mahler was, making his symphonies, his successes as a symphonist. And there was a huge, fight between, the people who didn't like, the direction that the younger generation was taking. So he was taking other resources. Sometimes now we look at Mahler's music because we're used to it, especially in America, which is interesting because Mahler became a composer so well known in the US. And that is something wonderful because it was at some point even loved more, and you see more Mahler symphonies performed by US orchestras than other orchestras in Europe. And it's because also it spoke fresher to a public that it was eager to be challenged. Let's not forget also Mahler made his last, let's say, career as a conductor in America. Many of the people that were a little bit attacking him in Vienna when he left were saying, oh yeah, go to America because he wants to, because they're offering him millions of dollars and they don't know anything about music. But it's just the opposite. It's just because America presented a more fresher approach and people were eager to get, more experimental. They didn't put too much resistance to certain things. Mahler's last concert at the Carnegie Hall with the New York Philharmonic was complete new music from Italian composers, Busoni, for instance, and Martucci, and he will never do that in Vienna. Probably in certain ways, yes, but he felt that it was easier and more rewarding to do all this stuff in America. So that let's not forget about these things that he had as a composer also, but as a performer. He was someone that was always experimenting.
We have another question here. This is from Suzanne. I'm going to paraphrase just a little bit, but she writes that she was interested in the exasperation expressed by Mahler with Natalie when she asked how one began composing, and then mentions an anecdote talking about the definition of a trumpet as a hole that you wrap tin around, as an analogy. You have nothing and you wrap notes around that. But then he also said that he got ideas from a poem or a melody. So obviously he would hear things around him that inspired him. So to those of us who don't or can't compose, this basically seems like magic. That all leads up to this very simple question for you, which is, do you compose? And if so, how did you begin?
I was waiting for it. No, I learned how to write music in the sense of, during your conservatory years. I was trained as a violinist, so that was my career in the conservatory. But you need to learn harmony, orchestration, and musical forms. So many of the assignments were to compose, to arrange. So I did a couple of arrangements. I started to compose a little bit. But to be a composer, I believe that you need to have a totally different mindset than a performer. There are cases in which you have both of them together, even nowadays. I mean, I think in earlier times it was more common. So that's why you have Mahler, a performer, a conductor, that was also a composer. The same thing with Bruckner, fantastic organist, Kapellmeister, but also composer. Even going back, Mozart was a performer of harpsichord and clavicembalo and fortepiano, and composed on the side also an opera composer as well. I think during modern times we started to separate a little bit of the two things because obviously the repertoire has become very extensive. So if you want to be a conductor or you have to be a violinist or a cellist, you have to dedicate yourself a lot to your activity, to, let's say, main activity. A composer who wants to compose needs also time to sit down and really, get all the ideas together. And also when you have, commissions and you need to organize yourself. If you're doing another career, then it becomes a little bit more hectic. There is a couple of people that still do that. I would say one of them is Esa-Pekka Salonen, fantastic conductor, music director of the LA Philharmonic, since many years, and also right now I think he's in the San Francisco Symphony. He is a very well-established composer, but he also says that sometimes he gives away time for the conducting to sit down as a composer. So it's tricky because you need to organize time. If you read another book, which I think it's very interesting, a book that I read during this past summer or the summer before, it's by a dear friend, Jamie Bernstein. She writes about her father, Leonard Bernstein, fantastic, famous conductor. He also was a composer, but he took a year off at one point of the New York Philharmonic just to concentrate on composing, because he wanted to do more important things with the composing, and he couldn't do it while he was conducting. So I would say that in that case, you have to decide where to go. I decided to, to take my career as a performer and later on as a conductor. So the composing part of it, it was just something that it was part of my training, but not as my career. I personally admire composers because that's a totally different view of the music itself. And I'm always, I always love to be surrounded by composers, and when I talk to them and when they tell you, the process, also the young ones, and I will make a mention of our Young Composers Project. It's incredibly fascinating. I invite you to dig more into this, because we have this fantastic program. And when you sit down with these kids that they're devoting themselves, they're learning also to how to play an instrument, but they're devoting themselves also to be a composer. It's fascinating to hear from there and to see in some of them that spark that is already, happening, that is hunger for music making, for creativity into the music making as a composer. So that I admire them. It's really fascinating.
I have another question here from one of our guests provided through the chat, and I'm sorry I don't have your name on this one, but I'll just read directly. Having been introduced to Mahler as a teenager and appreciating his music on a purely emotional level and a personal level, allowing the music to reflect my own thoughts and emotions, I find that having the history of the time and of a composer's life changes the experience of hearing it and also of playing it. I'm a violinist. Welcome to the club. And not always for the better. How do you reconcile the personal association with what's on the page versus what you know historically about the composer and his sometimes not very happy or moral lifestyle?
Very, very good question. I think in particular cases like in Mahler, the music itself speaks to you very straightforward. So you can take another way when you see that struggle maybe happening. On the other hand, I think it's up to you. And in my case, I try to open my ears as much as possible to hear more than just what the surface says. Example again with the Sixth Symphony, already from that beginning, you can think of something military about it. It's a march, yum, bum, bum, ba, da, dum, bum, bum. But probably you can read more than that. You can read a very incisive rhythm of anguish or tension. What is going on? Of course, when you read the history of the symphony when it was written, it doesn't apply what Alma Mahler said, which was later on that she said that this symphony, it was a reflection of the worst time for Mahler's life, which it happened the three things, therefore the three blows, the three hammer blows, three horrible things that happened in his life. The death of his youngest daughter, not youngest, first daughter, oldest daughter, the being diagnosed with his disease on the heart, and then being fired by the Vienna Staatsoper, so losing the job that he was very attached to. But that happened later on. That happened in 1909, 1910. So that was a little bit later. The symphony was written in 1904, 1905. But that doesn't mean that you can add things of his life to certain things that are the struggle or that tension, to that moment in that particular symphony. It might be a little bit simplistic just to remain that way. I think it's always important to respect the intensity of the music itself, what is in the text, in the musical text that speaks to you directly. And of course, you should give as much as fantasy as you can in order to maybe develop more of that feeling. Again, Sixth Symphony, that second theme, it's very passionate. It's love, it's passion for his wife, for the love of his life, for the love of your life, probably, if you're conducting it, if you're playing it. But you have to always respect that intensity that he's giving to it. Maybe you feel it different. Maybe you will feel it more like a tender song, but it's not written like that. It's written with drive. It's written with, and he says Leidenschaft. So he's already giving you something. You can add fantasy to it, but you should be able to resonate as much as you can with that message, and not try to do something totally different. One thing that you could do, and I can give you an example, at least in my opinion. When you look at the way Leonard Bernstein treats the adagietto, he stretches the tempo very much, even sometimes longer than what Mahler, was implying, because his personality to that music was like that. I feel that adagietto more like a love letter written in music. So it needs to flow a little bit, but that doesn't mean that it needs to be faster. That's why it's incredibly difficult for me, at least one of those movements that you need to master as much as you can. And it's you can't wait for the next time to perform it, because it has so much to say in many ways. So your personality is imprinted also in the music without doing anything. So you have to also respect what the music itself is saying by even without listening to it, just looking at the score.
We have another question here, and I'm going to add a little bit of something to the end of it, because it is a very good question, but it is also one that we could probably answer over the course of the next 17 hours. This comes from Shiri. In a few sentences, could you say what quality is it that for you distinguishes his greatness from others? Now, I would encourage you, Jose, to look at this maybe from both a macro or a sort of large point of view, and also very, very small, because that's kind of what Mahler is in a lot of ways. There's the concept of form and the grandiosity of concept, but there are also these amazing small things that he does in his orchestration, in his voicing, and the way that he creates sound that it is really unlike anything else. So with those kinds of ideas in mind, in what ways does Mahler set himself apart from the other great geniuses of composition?
I think obviously he was, again, I will repeat it again, he was a man of his time, but he was a man ahead of his time, much, much more ahead. And that's why that famous phrase that, one day people will, give me my time will come. That was the phrase. I think that defines a little bit of what he did with music. He was communicating to us universally and eternally, which many other composers did too. And I would say, in my personal taste and opinion, Beethoven, it's the other example of that kind of eternal, resonance. I think Mahler did that too, knowing it. That's the difference. I think Mahler, as being a conductor that also was traveling, that was also struggling with many of the things that, were really the struggle of his life. He lost many of his brothers and sisters, and when he was a kid, he lost one of his dear brothers. He was depressed and he killed himself, and that was a huge, impact for him. Death was very present somehow in his lifetime, or in his struggle as a man. The not being able to fulfill sometimes, the dreams that he wanted, and then fulfilling them, finally, and having to go through, a lot of turmoil because of the anti-Semitic, sense that was happening in Europe at the time, in Vienna, especially in Austria. Those things, they resonate much in his music, and he made the music very strong as well to resonate in the future. So why he's like that is just because I think he was it was not a matter of being smarter or more of a genius. He was probably being more honest, and he was he wasn't afraid to be Gustav Mahler himself, even though he was very concerned about many things that, you know, regarding his own inner world. But he was very through the music, he expressed, hey, this is me, whether you like it or not. And I think time has given us the opportunity to understand his greatness. Again, let's not forget that his music was banned for some time. You know, it was not played anymore. It was because the world was also taking different directions. You know, the 20th century was a period of time that, especially the beginning of the 20th century, that had a lot of things going on. The First World War, then the Second World War, the Russian Revolution, and in between all of these events, people were getting to that point of how do we express ourselves? Mahler found one way that he knew that would resonate in the future for sure. Others wanted to express themselves as well, but didn't resonate as well. And the music of Hans Eisler, for instance, you know, fantastic German composer in the beginning of the 20th century, wanted to resonate more into the revolutionary part of it. He was someone that, you know, he fervently, you know, believed on the tendency of a more, you know, a left wing kind of a mentality. His music didn't resonate that much, but not because of his political views, just because then things change, and probably that germ of eternality that the music needed to have, it didn't. Other composers with very simple gestures, they knew that it would resonate in different ways. Francis Poulenc gave probably the one of the first sketches of what we understand now as minimalism, but that didn't happen only with music. That happened with architecture. That happened with, you know, our visual arts and everything. So I think Mahler, it's great because it resonates still right now, and it's a combination of his mastery as a composer, but also because of he didn't restrain himself as an artist. He gave everything. I invite you to listen to that. I think I put it in that reading guide. There's a video of, there's many videos, but there's one that the person is explaining of Mahler's Ninth Symphony, and he says, you know, when you start, it starts very subtle with those, you know, leitmotifs of probably Mahler's heart condition, you know, because of this stability, and he's giving on a little bit of this kind of anguish feeling, and at some point it starts to develop, and he says you get to the bar 30, and you already gave everything, but you know that you have to give even more. So there's no way you can restrain yourself. You know, he says that, Berson says that I try to control myself always because I know that the symphony is long, but at that point, I just let myself go because there's no other way to do it. Mahler was like that. And you look at the caricatures when he was conducting, he was just explosive. He was giving everything, whether people liked it or not. He was being Gustav Mahler. So I think that might be one of the things why he's so great.
You did mention the many struggles that he went through in his life, and we just do have a comment here from one of our viewers today, Suzanne Ferguson, who mentions that learning about the incredible anti-Semitism that was directed towards him throughout his life was shocking and put his struggles into a new light for her, and that's a very very key part of his life. I see that we might have a hand raised from Robert. Robert, is that right? I'm going to go ahead and ask you to unmute before you talk. There you go. Hi, Robert.
It's interesting you just mentioned the comment from Suzanne, because I wanted to ask, because of what the text had to say, and I've appreciated your comments about the sort of cultural, ethnic, historical context. Maybe something about the Jewish elements and the religious elements, which seems to be a fairly heavy theme in the text. And how does that influence you in any way, or do you have persons who are performers who bring some context like that?
That's a very, very good question. I think it's a combination of both. Obviously, the music itself, and one example is that first symphony that has immediately in that third movement that Klezmer's music there, right? And you're like, is he being ironic? Is paying tribute to his own heritage, or is a combination of both. That's Gustav Mahler. He's even able sometimes to make a fool of himself, but to make you think, hey, just look at me, but don't laugh at me. Or if you want to laugh a different way. So yes, I am influenced by those things. I think I mean, you shouldn't take it all the way, especially when he's so straightforward. I would think that another composer and conductor, Mahler expert, Leonard Bernstein, going back to him, he did a little bit the same with his heritage as well, with certain music like West Side Story. West Side Story that maybe to the surface immediately we sound like, okay, that's jazzy, but there is a lot of klezmer there. The klezmer. There is a lot of Jewish influence music in that. I feel more of a Jewish side in Bernstein music than just jazz or Broadway style. So I think that's like I try to look at that as an example to combine those two worlds. You know, that there, and especially in Mahler's time, that it's a good point that you were saying that with the things that he had to struggle, he even got to the point that he changed his religion, that he changed his, he became a Catholic just for the sake of getting the job in the Vienna Staatsoper. But he, when you look at the Eighth Symphony that we were talking before, the first part, it's a hymn, Veni Veni Creator Spiritus, which you can, are you gonna take it to the Catholic environment or atmosphere only? I don't think so. He believed in spirituality, and that's why that symphony in that first part, in the Eighth Symphony, resonates so well with that sense of, I mean, the Catholic Church would say, oh, because it sounds like a hymn of praising God, but it can be also taken by a Lutheran. It could be used by many. It's just he's spiritual. I wonder, and I know I don't wonder anymore why he then chose fantastic poems by Chinese literature in Das Lied von der Erde, the Song of the Earth. That sounds also very spiritual. He was someone that took spirituality very serious, and I think it was something very important for him, but without the solemnity or without being narrow in one religion. Like maybe it's the case of Bruckner. Bruckner, you could say that he's speaking from the Catholic belief. His sense of praising God through his religion, in this case the Catholic, was reflected in the music immediately. Mahler, I think he was navigating in all of these things, and especially when he wants to show his Jewish heritage, he does it in a very, very impressive way, not only with specifics, but also with that kind of irony that I think tells us, that he was a man of his time, but also he was someone that was able to, like I said before, to express himself without any restraint, even though it created problems for him, for his life, definitely.
Well, we are almost out of time. I do want to quickly mention we had one question in the chat that we touched on a little bit earlier, but I did want to read it from Stephen. In addition to the enormous logistics and financial challenges, is there any performing space in Tucson that could hold the 400 to 500 performers that would be required to present the Eighth? Actually, we think that we absolutely could, and it may be something that we will do in the future. You can refer to Jose's earlier comments about that. So the last question that we're going to do today comes from Ben in Tucson. That's me. I know you probably weren't expecting to have to answer this question, but I'm going to ask you anyway, and it's pretty simple. What is your favorite Mahler symphony and why?
Wow. The easy answer, all of them. The difficult answer that's going to take us for the next call to talk about, it's seventh. Probably seventh for me is the one that I put my eyes a little bit more often. I haven't conducted it yet. I love that symphony. I played it as a violinist. I assisted that symphony, because Pavel Jarvi, when I was his assistant in Frankfurt, I assisted him during not only a recording of the symphony, but also a tour with that symphony, a short tour. And I find that symphony as a concerto for orchestra. That's one of the few ones in which the orchestra and the conductor together becomes the show element of the whole performance, because of the structure itself is very complex. It starts to be a little bit more expressionist in many ways. It tries to be a little bit off, the tracks. But on the other hand, also it has, especially the last movement, a lot of tempo changes and a lot of different, moods that you need to immediately tackle and get them very organic and organized as well. That the orchestra knows how to react to all of these things, and that it doesn't become also a section by section. So it's a symphony that requires a little bit of time to digest, but I think it's the one that, that once you get it probably closest to right, then it's incredibly rewarding. It's a symphony that is, for the technical point of view of playing, it's very uncomfortable sometimes. Trumpet in the last movement, it has to play many times the high C, and so the chances of making a mistake are always very soon. But apart from that, from the very beginning, it starts with that tension that somehow makes it incredibly appealing, at least for me. That beginning, yum, dum, that already is like, oh my god, this is nothing like the fifth. Because the fifth starts with a Trauer march, with a funeral march, very straight, with a trumpet thing. The third starts with the Brahms last movement of the first symphony, but in minor tom, pom 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 pom. So it's like a choral thing. The first starts with that, sounds of nature. The second, a burst of the Totenfeuer. Seventh is just this somber, sounds. So you're immediately, I am immediately captivated already talking about that symphony. So I would say 7. It will be unfair to say that there are others are not. I would say 7th, probably 10th as well, but 7th for sure.
Well, Jose, I can't thank you enough for all of your insight and all your time with this wonderful subject. We could go on for many, many hours with this, but I also want to take this opportunity to thank those of you who took your time out this Friday morning to join us to talk about this book and this wonderful composer, this institution of music that is one of the most important and fundamental things to classical orchestral musicians and conductors alike, and also listeners and lovers and appreciators of classical music, as you wonderful folks all undoubtedly are. I would like to remind you that next week on Friday afternoon, you can come back to the Tucson Symphony website and you can view a wonderful conversation that took place between José Luis Gomez and the guest conductor Perry So, who has been with us in the past and will be coming back to work with us in the future. He's an incredibly intelligent and interesting young man who is currently out in Hong Kong with his family doing some very interesting work. You'll love to hear what he and Jose have to talk about with their strangely shared experiences. They have a lot in common, and I think you'll enjoy hearing about that. So thank you all very much for being here today. Thank you for being supporters of the Tucson Symphony Orchestra. Thank you, José Luis Gomez. If you haven't had the opportunity to watch the conversation between Jose and Norman Lebrecht, the author of this book, it is available on our website, and I strongly encourage you. It is one of the most interesting hours you will ever spend listening to two people talk about music, and specifically Gustav Mahler. So on that note, thank you all very much. Have a great weekend. Stay healthy, stay safe. Goodbye, Jose.
Goodbye, Ben. And goodbye, everybody. Thanks for being with us. Bye-bye.